Liberty in our lifetimes in a free state of our own. That's the vision. That's the dream. And we are building it in New Hampshire. I'm Eric Brakey, your host and renegade statesman for the Porcupine Report. Welcome to your source for porcupine news and free-range conversation on matters of liberty. All right, let's hop into the show. Hello and welcome everyone to episode 35 of the Porcupine Report. I am, as always, your host, your renegade statesman, your executive director of the Free State Project, working hard every single day to bring more and more liberty-loving people to the state of New Hampshire, the live free or die state where we are building a liberty homeland for all who wish to breathe free from tyranny. Anyway, glad to have you with us this week. We're going to have a great episode with a great guest, someone who's been a good friend for a while. But before we get there, I want to tell you something exciting that's coming up for the Free State Project and for myself personally. This weekend, myself and also our guest, who will be on with us in a moment, are both heading to the Imperial City, Washington, D.C., Are we going to hobnob with politicians and ask for favors from the politically powerful? No, of course not. That's not what we do. We are going to rage against the war machine, rage against the imperialism, the war, and to call for peace. My whole life, we have been in blunder after blunder, war after war, and what can we do but fight back, stand up, speak out? And of course, you know, it's not just always going to the Imperial City and raging. It is also doing very practical things like efforts in our state legislatures for defend the guard legislation, calling our National Guard troops home from wars that have not been declared as the Constitution requires by Congress. We'll be talking a little bit more about that with our guest. But I just wanted to say, if you watched our recent episode with Angela McArdle, the chair of the National Libertarian Party, you may have noticed that she invited us, the Free State Project, to come down and participate. And that's exactly what we're doing. I will be heading down there. I'll be speaking at the rally. And I just thought it might be nice to mention some of the other folks that if you tune in, whether you can be there in person, some folks are going in person, or you just happen to watch online the speeches that take place. I believe it's in the Washington, Mall. Some of the speakers that I'm excited to hear from and be on the same stage as include Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who was the foreign policy advisor in the Trump White House, who was appointed to help wind down and end the war in Afghanistan. I think that he is fantastic. Personally, I think he would make a tremendous Secretary of Defense, though I don't know that we will ever be so fortunate and so lucky as that. Daniel McAdams, who co-hosts Ron Paul's daily show, the Ron Paul Liberty Report. He will be speaking. Gabriel Shipton, the brother of Julian Assange, who's been a big advocate for his brother's freedom. Our guest will be on in a moment, Dan McKnight, who leads the Bring Our Troops Home, Defend the Guard movement. Clint Russell, Josie the Redheaded Libertarian, our own friend from here in the Free State, Aaron Day, and many others. Jordan Page, even. Jordan Page. I don't know if he's singing or speaking, but if you don't know Jordan Page, he's like, boy, from the old days, from the Ron Paul days, he was like the great musician, folk singer of the Ron Paul Revolution. I'll look forward to seeing him and many others. So that's going to be a fun event and an important event, an opportunity to stand up, speak out in the Imperial City against the imperial designs of the war machine. Because as we all know, as Smedley Butler said, war is a racket. And as many have said, including Murray Rothbard, though I don't remember, I think he was quoting someone else, war is the health of the state. And if you are interested in promoting liberty, then you must be interested in opposing these unconstitutional, undeclared foreign wars. So looking forward to that this Saturday. And now let's get to our guest for today, who I've teased a little bit. His name is Dan McKnight. He leads the organization Bring Our Troops Home, and they have been working in state legislatures across the country to promote Defend the Guard legislation. I personally called it years ago when I was still at Young Americans for Liberty. And this was still a new idea, fairly fresh idea that many people were dismissing as, oh, you'll never get very far with that. States can't stand up to the federal government when it comes to war. Well, states are starting to more and more saying, if you do not declare war, Congress does not declare war, you do not get to have access to our National Guard troops. And of course, here in New Hampshire, in the Free State, our lower chamber, the House of Representatives, became the first lower chamber in America to pass Defend the Guard, and at least two other states in their upper chambers in, I believe, Idaho and Arizona have passed Defend the Guard. So this is growing in momentum. It is scaring the powerful, and an opportunity for states that love freedom to lead the way, not just in terms of freedom within our own borders for domestic policies, but really saying we will not further supply our troops and the blood of our sons and daughters to wars that Congress doesn't even care enough to declare. So we'll be talking about that and more with our guest. Let's welcome to the show, Dan McKnight.
Eric, appreciate you having me on. It's good to be here.
Hey, Dan, it's a real pleasure. I know, boy, you've been at this for a while. How long has Bring Our Troops Home as an organization been operating? How did it get started? And was Defend the Guard always like the strategy that you were pursuing there? Or is that something through trial and error you guys found this is the way?
No, that's a great question. So Bring Our Troops Home started in January of 2019, and then we officially formed in February of 2019. And what happened was I was a member of the Idaho Army National Guard. I enlisted in the National Guard after a tour in the United States Marine Corps, one in the United States Army, and then I came home and went to college, and I enlisted in the National Guard after 9/11. I joined the National Guard because I wanted to go and avenge America after 9/11, and the Idaho National Guard was an attack helicopter, Apache, a helicopter battalion that was built to fight in the mountains of Afghanistan. And in 2005 through 2007, we were deployed a National Guard unit to an active combat zone, which is at the time was a fairly novel concept. And the National Guard wasn't wanted there. We were with 10th Mountain Division and the 82nd Airborne Division, and they thought of us as kind of less than weekend warriors, part-time soldiers. But I'll tell you, Eric, between the United States Marine Corps, the United States Army, and the Idaho Army National Guard, the best trained, the most committed were the National Guardsmen, who every single time they put on their uniform, it was for one purpose, and that was to fulfill the mission. There was no senseless training or sensitivity classes or any of the other stuff that we see, the social engineering going on in the military today. So we were kind of put aside. And after a month or so of being in country, we had men in my command from the National Guard who were running out of supplies. Our boots were worn out. Our uniforms were torn and tattered. We couldn't get protective equipment like gloves and goggles or body armor. And we tried every method we could find to exhaust within the chain of command, within the active duty military supply system. And we couldn't get the supplies we needed because nobody wanted us there. And out of frustration and through a friend back home, I got the cell phone number of the Idaho governor. His name was Jim Risch. And I climbed to the top of a mountain deep in the Pesh River Valley in northeastern Afghanistan. And I got a real clear signal on my satellite phone. And I called the governor on his cell phone. And he answered. And I said, Governor Risch, this is Sergeant Dan McKnight from the Idaho Army National Guard. I'm calling you from a mountaintop in Afghanistan. I hope I have your attention. And he goes, Sergeant McKnight, you've got my attention. What can I do for you? And I relayed the situation that we were there. He was our commander-in-chief of the National Guard. He had Idahoans that were in danger's way. We couldn't get help, and I needed him to do something. And he said, Dan, I was just elevated to the governor's office a few months ago. Our governor had gone back to D.C. to take a cabinet position. He goes, I understand the Constitution, and I understand that I am the commander-in-chief of the Idaho National Guard. I don't know what I can do, but I'll do something. And satisfied with that answer, I hung up and I walked back down to our forward operating base. And 48 hours later, my battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel, essentially kicked my door in and yelled, "Sergeant McKnight, I don't know what you've done. Give me your satellite phone." And he took it away from me and then proceeded to tell me that the supplies that we needed were on the way. And he, threatened me, "Don't ever do that again," because I violated and embarrassed him. So I held Jim Risch up on this pedestal as this kind of a hero. He took care of us. He understood the Constitution and the proper, enumerated powers. But I was very disillusioned about the war. I saw fraud, waste, and abuse happening, and I saw the mistreatment of soldiers. I saw a mission that had no purpose, had no strategy. It had no definition of success or victory. It had no way to come home. And when I did come home, I was injured, and the National Guard didn't want me anymore because of my injuries, and I went underground. I became very angry, but I watched my friends from the National Guard go back for their 5th, their 6th, their 7th combat tour, and I had this burning inside of me that something needed to be done. And in 2019, we had a president that was saying the things out loud that I had in my heart, that these wars are ridiculous. They don't have a purpose. We don't have a strategy. And I recognized that this man that I'd once held on a pedestal, Governor Jim Risch, had gone back to Washington, D.C., and he was now Senator Risch, and he served as the chairman of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, one of the most powerful people in foreign policy in America. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to ask Jim Risch to do us a solid. I'm going to see if he'll do us a favor again. But you can't just call the chairman of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations like I could the governor when I had a cell phone. So I wrote an op-ed and challenged him to use his position to advocate for peace. Give it a shot. Let's try peace once. And 9 newspapers in my home state of Idaho picked up that op-ed and ran it. And 2 weeks later, Jim Risch was at home giving a speech before the Chamber of Commerce. I grabbed a veteran buddy of mine who had a camera, and we went to the event. And I said, "I want you to turn that camera on as soon as you see me stand up." And after he got done with his speech, I stood up to ask a question, and the camera turned on. And I said, "Senator Risch, my name is Dan McKnight. You helped me in Afghanistan about 15 years ago." And he stopped me right there. He goes, "Dan, I remember you. I remember that situation. And I've read your op-ed. I agree. We're done nation building. We're done sending American dollars and sons and daughters into a foreign land of a place that doesn't want us there. We're through with nation building." And right there in Boise, Idaho, the chairman of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations turned U.S. foreign policy upside down and shook it out. And I thought, man, this is easy. Politics is easy, right? 2 for 2. And old Jim Risch got on a plane and went back to Washington, D.C. And 3 times over the next 90 days, he voted to extend the wars indefinitely in Afghanistan, Yemen, and Syria. And I knew that something more had to be done, because even Jim Risch, even the man who I thought understood us, was going to do the wrong thing every time he was given the chance. And so we took 100 lawmakers and veterans from around the country. We started getting friends together and created this network, this signal chat, and we started talking to each other. And we raised a little bit of money. We took us all back to Washington, D.C., and we held this event where veterans were telling their stories from the global war on terror, and how the National Guard had been ripped out of these communities, and how soldiers had gone back for 5, 6, 7, 8 combat deployments. And we challenged every member that we took there, every one of the 100 people that we took, to go visit their members of Congress and make the case for giving peace a chance, make the case for constitutional declarations of war, make the case for letting us come home from these endless wars. And one of our members went and sat before Liz Cheney and asked her the question, what conditions on the ground must be met for you to advocate for ending the war and bringing the troops home? And she looked him dead in the eye, and she goes, as long as I'm here in Washington, D.C., we will never, never come home from Afghanistan. And that's when we left, licked our wounds a little bit, and decided we can't fight in Washington, D.C. We can't fight in the swamps. We have to go somewhere else. We have to get a tactical advantage. And we decided we were going to live by this concept of lift where you stand, and we were going to go back to the states, and we were going to fight in state houses. And so we started looking for a way to do that. And we discovered a man named Pat McGeehan. He's a delegate from the West Virginia legislature who'd been running this bill, Defend the Guard, for a couple years. And to give some credit to your home state of Maine, it actually had been done before Pat McGeehan in your Maine with, I'm forgetting Abby's last name.
Yeah, Representative Erin Libby.
And Libby, excuse me, I'm sorry. Erin, and she had run the bill even before Pat, but it had never really gained traction. Yeah. And the bill basically says that the states will withhold their National Guard from going overseas to fight in a foreign conflict unless Congress has first declared war. Congress has to put their name on the line before the National Guard will put their boots on the ground. And we adopted this Defend the Guard legislation. And we've been fighting in every state in the nation, and we've had it sponsored and introduced in over 30 states. And as you mentioned earlier, the first lower house to pass it was New Hampshire. The Arizona Senate has passed it twice, and the Idaho Senate passed it for the first time this year, and traction is gaining. And in this effort to adopt Defend the Guard, we've built this organization, Bring Our Troops Home, and we've become advocates in every state. We train activists all over the country, and we're doing the hard work of fighting the Goliath.
Well, thank you. And there's a lot of questions I want to unpack there in all of that. First of all, I also want to give credit to, I believe, former State Representative Aaron Libby of Maine, who sponsored it in 2011. You're right; it got like maybe 13 votes in the House of Representatives that year, and it got a roll call vote, so that was something. But it didn't really go anywhere from there. Kind of lay fallow for a while, and there is tremendous credit due, I think, to Pat McGeehan for really carrying that fight forward. In fact, I'm a big fan of his, and he wrote a great book, by the way, called Stoicism in the State House, which is a great handbook for any liberty legislator trying to keep to their principles and not sell their soul and be effective in their state house, which I recommend. But I want to go back to you, talk about Jim Risch. And, he came through for you early on. He seemed to have an understanding of the problem. And yet, as you mentioned, when it came time to follow through in Washington, D.C., in the position that he was in, that did not happen. Now, maybe we can only speculate as to why that was. Maybe in a position like that, you try to push back against the wars and you get your committee chairmanship taken away, or the military industrial complex comes in and starts funding a primary challenger against you, or what have you. Do you have any particular thoughts in that particular case for that particular individual, why you got such good rhetoric, but then when it came time to do the right thing in Washington, D.C., it never materialized?
Sure. I have a great answer for this. I think the only honest answer we've ever had in this effort since we started actually came from Liz Cheney. Every other answer we've gotten has been, the yellow ribbon, we support the troops. Let's take a picture so I can show our constituents. And so I think Jim Risch did what politicians do. No offense to present company. I think that politicians are going to talk out of one side of their mouth, and they're going to do what their puppet masters tell them to do. And if you look at the Capitol Mall, and we'll get a chance to do this when we get there this weekend, Eric, and I'm going to put my arm around you and I'm going to have us do a 360, and we're going to look all the way around us. Every building that is tall, that is built with glass and steel, that's a magnificent building that surrounds the beautiful marble buildings of our federal government, are all occupied by defense contractors. There's nobody else owns the area around the Capitol Mall except for defense contractors, that we are beholden to them. Our politicians do what they are told because this military industrial complex runs Washington, D.C. It greases the wheels. And now we're starting to see them use rhetoric like a war in Ukraine is good for American jobs. I'm sorry, war should never be a social jobs program, but politicians are beholden to the deepest pockets. And that's why we don't fight in D.C. anymore. In fact, you and I going to D.C. this weekend is almost a slap in our own face. But we are going there because that's where you get the attention of the people. When you go to Washington, D.C., there's some gravitas to that. But I think that politicians will always do what is in their interests and the interests of their puppet masters.
I think it's interesting, right? They're calling the rally, and I guess this is the second year they've done it, Rage Against the War Machine. And of course, it's a playoff of the Rage Against the Machine band, which these days, as I understand it, they rage much more for the machine than against the machine. I don't know what happened to them and what changed, but Rage Against the War Machine. But I do think it's appropriate too, as you know, like that's pretty much all you can do in the Imperial City. That you're not going to go in there and dismantle the war machine. You can go there and you can stand up and raise attention for your cause and speak out against it. At least for now, they haven't. They're starting to crack down on our ability to speak against these things, but for the moment, we still can hopefully go there and speak. But I think you're absolutely right. For so long, right, the strategy. I mean, you go back to the anti-war protests when the war in Iraq began in 2003, and we began to realize that we were in this period of forever indefinite wars that are never constitutionally authorized, that never get an actual declaration. It's just Congress perhaps maybe sometimes passes an AUMF and says we authorize the executive branch to decide if we are at war, unconstitutionally delegating their authority away to another branch of government. But of course, even in conflicts like Syria, they don't even bother to do that, right? The president just, and I say the president, the executive branch, I guess I mean more than anything, because, but the executive branch takes us to war, puts troops in harm's way, and nobody ever votes on it, which means that nobody who is elected can ever be held accountable for the decision, and the wars go on autopilot. And so what do, right? When Congress doesn't want to go on record because they don't want to get voted out of office like some people did when they voted for the Iraq War AUMF. They know these wars are very unpopular back home. But they want to continue receiving the support and the donations of the military industrial complex. They've got like the perfect situation. Just never vote on the wars and let other people take who we the people don't have any say over whether they have a job or not. Let them be the decision makers. And so we're stuck there, and we've been there for 2 decades before you all at Bring Our Troops Home really sparked this. There were these individual efforts for Defend the Guard, but nothing like the coordinated state-by-state effort that you all have put together. And I can see that, even sponsoring it in the Maine State Senate this past year, that and seeing the fight in New Hampshire as well, that the top military brass seems to be getting nervous about the momentum that's building behind Defend the Guard. It does seem to be they recognize they have an Achilles heel here because, of course, the states constitutionally, unless they declare war, unless they're suppressing an insurrection, repelling an invasion, or enforcing a law of the Union, the federal government doesn't have legitimate authority over our National Guard to put them into active combat zones. And they're starting to get nervous. What are you seeing in terms of the response as Defend the Guard builds in momentum from the Pentagon?
Yeah, absolutely. So you know this, and I'm glad you actually asked. Every time we have a hearing in one of the chambers, whether it's in the Senate or in the House, in any state house across the country, we pack the room with veterans and grassroots activists and liberty activists supporting the bill. They're to offer testimony. And in opposition to the bill is generally 1 or 2 people, sometimes 3. It's the adjutant general from the state, so it's somebody with a 2 or a 3-star collar on their collar, and their chief of staff, and even a legal counsel for them. And so they stand up like this Jack Nicklaus moment from A Few Good Men with all the ribbons and the awards. And we're there, often battered and beaten and bruised, bearded veterans who've come home and are trying to just put their lives back together. And the contrast is very stark. And if you listen to the testimony, one is heartfelt, one is based on the Constitution and reason and fairness and the rule of law. And the other one is based on money. And the reason why they hate us is because of who and what we're doing. It's very, very, very hard to stop a genuine, organic grassroots movement without showing your hand as a draconian, tyrannical, federal overreach industrial complex. They hate us because we expose them for who they are. Liz Cheney, Chuck Schumer, Kamala Harris, Mitch McConnell, they're never going to pay the price of war with their own bodies or their own blood or their own children. But they'll send you and me, and they'll send our children to go fight and die while they get rich with the contracts from their own private holding companies and the backdoor money laundering operations that are conducted right out in the open, hazy daylight of the DC swamps. And so they are worried because towns and communities across America, we understand a few gospel truths. One of them is that the power belongs to us, the people. We understand that the federal government only has the power to do what we explicitly tell it to do. We understand that undeclared war is a betrayal and a subversion of the republic. We understand that the military-industrial complex will never stop unless we act. And we understand that Defend the Guard is how we deprive the war machine of half of its war power. And so we see these battles in state houses all across the country, and the opposition is lined up They're organized, and their message is always the same. It's about money.
A few things there. I think it's interesting you said half of their power. And I think that that's such an important point to underscore, because oftentimes I think people don't realize just how much our National Guard, our National Guard troops account for the forces on the ground in these wars over the last 20 years, right? This certainly has been a big transformation from how it used to be. And now, at least the numbers I've seen, right, our National Guard troops from the 50 different states account for about half of troops on the ground in these conflicts that have taken place in Iraq and Afghanistan. But it wasn't always that way, right? Before the war on terror and then in the advent of the war on terror, how would you describe how the role of the National Guard has changed? I guess in the Bush era and later.
Sure, absolutely. So it's important to understand the role of the National Guard. And I'm the first one to say this. We fight in an anti-war movement, but I myself am not an anti-war advocate, right? I believe that there is a time and a place. There's a just war theory, that's been propagated by Thomas Aquinas and some of the great thinkers like Socrates. Just war is a responsible reaction to an actual threat, done with proper authority, done with limited force, or a proper response. So I do believe that there is a time and a place for war. And in America, we have a rule that says when we go to war, that Congress, the representatives of the people, will give the informed consent of the people in order to go. And in our Constitution, the militia, which has now been codified as the National Guard, serves three purposes, three constitutional purposes. That's it: to enforce the laws of the Union, to repel an invasion, and to put down an insurrection. Nowhere in those three purposes do you hear that our job is to go fight in these foreign adventures, these misadventures, these regime change wars. However, a declaration of war by Congress signed by the president becomes the law of the Union, thus giving the authority to the federal government to call forth the militia or the National Guard to go and fight and win America's wars. It is a proper role of the National Guard. So it's changed because we used to actually follow that, right? We used to believe that the militias of the state, or the National Guard as it's been codified, were there for the defense and the readiness of the states to be called upon by the federal government for those three purposes that I just mentioned. However, in the Bush era and since that time, America has become this bloodthirsty organization that is out there trying to leapfrog across the world and set up remote bases, fight wars, chase bad guys of our own making or not. And in order to do that, it takes a massive force. And it took about 8 months into the global war on terror before the active military was exhausted from the pace of war and fighting on multiple fronts and all across the Middle East. And they couldn't maintain these wars without doubling the size of their force. And you can't do that through recruitment. You can't do it through appropriations through Congress. You could have only done it by usurping your authority and pulling the National Guard into this horrible foreign policy. And so the National Guard became half of this force structure that became an offensive weapon. It became the easy button for the generals who were propagating these wars. And the National Guard began occupying places like Djibouti, Africa, and remote outposts in Afghanistan, fighting on the streets of Ramadi in Iraq. And now they're in Syria as we speak right now today. National Guard has been killed in Yemen, and in Syria, and in Lebanon, and Libya, in Afghanistan, Africa, all across the central plains of Africa. And so the National Guard is now backfilling and doing the missions that the active duty military could never possibly do, because American military is always built on two forces, two fronts, two wars at one time. We're not fighting two wars anymore, Eric. We're fighting 17, 18, 20. Depends on the month and the day and the year.
But I heard from Kamala Harris recently that we don't have any troops in active war zones. Obviously, I remember seeing a video of some troops in an active war zone who were watching that video and then just looking around at each other. So I'm wondering, well, where the hell are we? How does someone like Kamala Harris, and Joe Biden himself has made similar statements, how do they get away with saying that? I mean, what is the most generous possible interpretation of what they mean, where you could construct this in a way where you could make the case they're not just outright lying to the American public?
Absolutely. I'm going to give them the most generous one possible, and it's based on fact. There are no uniformed United States military men or women fighting in an active war zone, period. Because America has failed to declare war. We're not fighting in wars because Congress has abdicated their authority, their role, their responsibility. They've thrown it back to the executive branch and said, you can go fight in these skirmishes, these armed conflicts, these police actions, these peacekeeping missions. You can do whatever you want. We'll just write the check. And so technically they're correct, but anybody that's been to war knows that when that crack and whiz of a bullet flying by your head, you know that you're not in a conflict. You know you're in a war. And so the men and women that are coming home in flag draped boxes, we know when your friends are blown up on a roadside bomb or with a suicide a bomber at Abbey Gate at the Afghanistan airport, you know. Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, and all the other ilks that are the stooges for the military-industrial complex, they have no idea what war is. They have no idea what they're saying or doing, because if they did, they would do the most important thing first, and that is the enumerated powers that we've given them to represent us, to do with our name, with our vote. They would do those things first, but they don't. They'd rather go to these cocktail hours and these press events and get their name and their face out in front of the public, but they don't know what war is. And so Kamala Harris, I'm going to give her the most generous benefit of the doubt. I think she genuinely believes what she said, but she's just flat wrong because she does not understand that when you're being shot at, you know you're in a combat zone.
Yeah. And of course, by that definition, we've had no troops in any war zones since World War II.
83
right?
years, yep.
Everyone
Right.
who died in Vietnam, president at the time, because Johnson or Nixon could get up and say, we don't have any troops in active war zones, right? Because Congress has never declared it.
It's absolutely the most insulting thing that a politician can say or do, next to sending us to that war without authorization. But the next most insulting thing they can do is to discredit our service by saying that we're not actually participating and surviving in a war zone.
Yeah. And of course, if that were actually true, right, they would have no objection to defend the guard legislation, because it only brings troops home from war zones where active combat is taking place, right? They can still be deployed for training missions overseas and for non-combat in the non-combat areas. So defend the guard would effectively not change anything, right? If it was true what Kamala Harris says.
If it was true what they said, but here's the beauty of the legislation, Eric. We put a line in the legislation that says, we define that we won't be deployed to combat, to war, to armed conflicts, or to serve as an instrumentality of war. That line right there puts the final the death nail into the coffin that says you will not take us to go and put us in a place where we are shooting at or being shot at in a conflict of any sort. That instrumentality of war clause in the bill is maybe the most important.
Awesome. Well, and I know it's been very interesting to see, right, in the committee hearings on these bills, or at least the ones that I've seen. I'm sure to some degree this is similar across other states. But as you said before, right, the arguments of the proponents for defend the guard, or these wars are unconstitutional, these wars are not in the interests of America, we are not advancing freedom or liberty. In fact, all these wars run counter to that. And the only argument the opponents have had is money. If our state does this, then what if the federal government, what if Washington, D.C. threatens to cut off funding for this or that and tries to retaliate against us? But it is very interesting, I think, that is where the argument is. I mean, 10 years ago, that wouldn't have been the line in the sand. 10 years ago, I mean, I guess 10 years ago, we're talking 2014. Maybe things were starting to shift then. But I guess in the first decade of the war on terror, right, it would have been the opponents of defend the guard who would be arguing, right, that these wars are just and noble, and we're spreading democracy and freedom, and you're against all of these things, right, if you are trying to bring the troops home. But it is interesting now that the proponents of these wars, they've conceded that ground because nobody believes them anymore. Nobody believes these wars are for freedom and democracy. Nobody believes this is for anything other than money, right?
Absolutely. I think the emperor has no clothes. I think everybody sees what American and veterans have thought for years, and it's just becoming almost like throw your hands in the air. What can we do about it? And they just accept it because they're not going to get the narrative being told to them on the mainstream media. They're lied to by their own politicians. I think people just don't understand that anti-war movement or that just war movement of 10, 20, 50, 70 years ago doesn't really exist anywhere except with us. I call us the modern day rebels, the counterculturists of today's society. We're the modern day hippies, like the Haight-Ashbury generation from Vietnam.
Yeah. I remember, and I know you knew my good friend Sergeant Aaron Rollins, who served in the Main Army National Guard and served multiple tours in Iraq, and who survived a roadside explosion that several of his colleagues did not survive. And I know he always came back and talked to me about his friend who was sitting in the seat that day that he normally would have been sitting in, who did not come home that day, or at least did not come home intact. I remember sitting there with him in the public hearing, right? The adjutant general for the Main Army National Guard going up there and making the argument that we can't do this because of money, right? And I just remember walking out of that room with him and him turning to me and saying, boy, I wish that he would look my buddy's mother in the face and tell her that her son's death was worth it because the state got a few more Humvees out of the deal, right? It's such a morally bankrupt argument, and the fact that we're even like that even carries weight with the political class when we're talking about the Constitution, we're talking about human lives, the lives of our best, our brightest, our most patriotic in uniform, and that's like on one end of the scale, and the other end of the scale is money, and money's coming out on top. It's atrocious, and of course Sergeant Aaron Rollins is no longer with us, but he was a big advocate for Defend the Guard, and well, I just wanted to mention him because I always want to mention him because he's such a hero to me.
He's often on my mind, Eric, so thank you.
Well, so this Saturday, you're going to be in Washington. I'm going to be in Washington. What are you looking forward to with the Rage Against the War Machine rally?
Last year at the Rage, I had a chance to speak to some incredible people, Jimmy Dore and Tulsi Gabbard and the great Ron Paul. But this year I'm going with a little bit different message. And I want to talk to you about the New Hampshire effort, but we'll do that in a second. Yeah. I want to talk about the fact that we can't fight in DC effectively. It's a David versus Goliath fight, right? And David, he didn't pick up traditional weapons of war and put on armor and march into the fight to fight the giant, right? He picked up small, smooth stones, took very careful aim with them. And that's what we're doing with Defend the Guard. We don't go to DC to fight with big voices and big budgets and big celebrities. We're choosing small, smooth stones that we call state legislatures and state representatives and bill champions and activists. And then we are laser focusing on taking away 50% of the giant military industrial complex fighting bodies by enforcing constitutional rule of law. And that's my message going into there is that, we're not going to go to DC. We're going to go to the small towns across America and, Madison, Wisconsin, not the military industrial complex, is going to preserve the republic. It's going to be Richmond, Virginia, not the ruling class that puts America people first, and it's going to be Cheyenne, Wyoming, and not the shills in DC that protect our soldiers. And then you work your way all the way down to all across these different capitals. And, it ends with the message that we have to lift where we stand. We have to fight where we have the most leverage. I see my state senator and my state representatives weekly. I run into them at the grocery store, dropping our kids off for school, at church, walking my dog around the neighborhood. Who do you think I have more influence with? Those three individuals that represent me, or with my state representative, who happens to be a good man, Congressman Russ Fulcher, who I see once or twice a year at fundraising efforts. My message at Rage is going to be, let's do something practical. No more drum circles. No more, fancy slogans. No more wasting donors' money. We're going to fight, and we're going to be effective, and we're going to stay laser focused, and we're going to pick a few smooth stones, and we're going to use them effectively.
Awesome. Something I wanted to ask you about too. I know you and I, we saw each other at the Republican National Convention. I was a delegate from Maine. You were there as a delegate from Idaho. And one thing that always kind of struck me as so bizarre at that convention. Well, first of all, I say it was nice to see a few speakers who were speaking out against war. I'm trying to remember the one gentleman who spoke, who just kind of like gave a very excellent like brief outline of like how in the world did we get into this war with Russia that we are apparently in right now, outlining the 2014 overthrow of the democratically elected president of Ukraine, the installation of a puppet state by then Vice President Joe Biden and Victoria Nuland under him. So that was nice to see, even as people like Mike Pompeo were still there, being given speeches. Who's of course, in my mind, a war criminal. And of course, what he tried to do to murder Julian Assange is something he should be prosecuted for. But what the weirdest thing was, I remember these signs that were handed out. They went all across the floor of the convention, and the sign said, "Trump will end the war in Ukraine." And I thought, great. This is like all the other bullshit, the stuff I don't like that's being talked about, issues I don't agree with. Like, this is the one issue that like I can be here for. Like, I'm here for this. I'm here to say no to war. And I'm so glad to see the neocons losing power in the party. The fact that you could have a sign like this being distributed all across the floor for people to hold on camera and signal, yes, this is what we're behind, Trump ending the war in Ukraine. Except that someone came around, supposedly from the RNC, and tried to collect up all of those signs and said, this is not an authorized sign. You've got to give it back. I refused to give them back, and I hoarded as many as I could for myself. I said, this is why I'm here. You're not taking it from me. And I know I gave a couple extra ones to you.
Yes.
What did you make of that? Like, that was, I mean, it was bizarre to me. I don't know what to make of it. Like,
that was a very bizarre situation. I just sent 2 of those down to my communications director, Hunter Durenzis, down in Florida. He requested that I bring them home and send them to him so he could preserve them forever. He's got them in his collection now. I've got 2 almost within arm's reach in my office, right where I'm at right now.
Yeah.
I treasure those, and I'm grateful that you grabbed as many as you did, and also calling the attention to it. But I think that's what we're seeing is, I think the Republican Party, members of the Republican Party, have shifted away from this stupid concept of going to these wars all over the world. And the Lindsey Grahams and the Mitch McConnells and the Tom Cottons, that is yesterday's Republican Party. But there's still that influence of the RNC until we get it all out of here, root and branch, get rid of all of them, including the Mike Pompeos. We're going to have that problem where that we have to support America, spread democracy, apple pie, baseball, all of it has to be spread around the world at the end of a gun. That's going to happen forever. And so we've been working really hard to kind of weasel our way in, if you will, and changing the structure of the Republican Party from the inside. And it starts with efforts like what you did in Maine and what we've done in Idaho, in Montana, New Hampshire, in Arizona, in Georgia, in Texas, and getting Defend the Guard added as an official plank of the state party platform of the Republican Party. And we keep doing this across the country. And we even got it to the point where the Republican Party of Texas put it on the ballot in the primary this year under Proposition 6. And it said, let's see if I can get it. The Texas legislature should prohibit the deployment of the Texas National Guard to a foreign conflict unless Congress has first formally declared war. Vote yes or no. And you'll love this. In that election, the March election of this year, who was the most popular, most well-known candidate on the Republican primary ballot this year? Donald Trump. Donald Trump got 1.8 million votes and got 77% of the vote. On the same ballot, Proposition 6 to Defend the Guard got 1.869 million votes, outperforming Donald Trump 83%. Coincidentally enough, the no votes, there were about almost 500,000 no votes on Defend the Guard. There was also about 450,000 Nikki Haley votes. So that's where that opposition comes from. The old Republican Party is still there, but they're dwindling, and they're dwindling under this beautiful Federalist movement of Americans standing up and saying, we believe in America first. We believe in states' rights and states' authority. We believe in the rights of the people and the power of the people. And the RNC this year was a great demonstration of that with the confiscation of the ending the war in Ukraine signs.
Yeah, I'll tell you, it seems like every day I see something in the media where some former Republican official or something is getting up and saying, I don't recognize this Republican Party anymore. I'm voting for Kamala Harris. I'm just thinking, you know what? Good. Go vote for Kamala Harris. I will gladly trade away the Liz Cheneys, the Dick Cheneys, what's that congressman who was on the big Russia.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Crybaby. Anyway.
Yeah. Anyway, Kinzinger. That's right. I'll gladly trade all of them away if in exchange we're getting people like Tulsi Gabbard and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who I will be the first to admit, like, they're not perfect on these issues either. And certainly, you know, when it comes to some of the Middle East wars, they're maybe not as good as they are with like the Russia-Ukraine wars. But boy, is it an improvement over where things were. And the realignment is wonderful to see, and to watch the neoconservatives lose control of the party that, you know, as much as they try to claim the mantle of conservatism for themselves and say that they're the real conservatives, I think we just have to remember that, no, they're called neoconservatives for a reason. They infiltrated the conservative movement. The neoconservative movement actually comes from Trotskyite Marxism. This is an absolute perversion of conservatism, and the only thing they actually want to conserve is the empire. They don't care about conserving our Constitution or our liberties or even, you know, our states or our country. They just want a global empire that they can all profit off of. And so if they want to go vote for Kamala Harris and join the Clinton neoliberal party, then hey, I think we're getting a good trade out of the deal.
Absolutely.
I did want to note, you know, of course, we want to note specifically kind of New Hampshire. Of course, I was proud to get kind of Maine to adopt Defend the Guard in the Republican platform, even if we weren't able to get it passed through either house of the legislature, though we did get roll call votes in each. And when we did get into the platform, my opponents on that legislation, in particularly one of my my loudest Republican opponent in the Senate on that, was not too happy to learn that the party had adopted it. But in New Hampshire, of course, it's in the platform, but it also passed in the House of Representatives. And I always go back to, you know, there's a quote that you guys are always using in your promotional materials. I didn't know this quote until I heard it from you all, but from Daniel Webster, right, who was the U.S. Secretary of State. Was that in the early 1800s, perhaps?
Yep, for two presidents.
Yeah, and he predicted, right, that, and he was a New Hampshire man, right? He predicted that there would come a time when the states have to interpose between their militias and arbitrary use of them by the national government. And of course, that's exactly where we are. So I think it's highly historically poetic that New Hampshire is helping to lead the way on Defend the Guard, just as he predicted his own state is helping to lead the charge there. What can you say to, I know you've been focused on the big picture and you've been working this in many states around the country, but what recollections do you have of this last year of the role that New Hampshire specifically has played in this effort?
Yeah, so we try to stay very connected to every fight, but there are so many of them it does become difficult. But our bill sponsor in New Hampshire this year was Representative John Patuchik, who was fabulous on this issue, and he worked with other people like Representative Tom Mannion and Representative Emily Phillips, and they did a good job. HB 229 was the bill this year, and that was the House bill number for Defend the Guard, and it passed in the New Hampshire House 187 to 182, 183 maybe, 182 or 183. I can't remember. It was close. But Representative Ellen Reed, who is a progressive anti-war Democrat, was the bipartisan vote that put us over the top and gave us the victory. So it wasn't just a Republican effort. It was a principled bipartisan effort. I think we had a majority of Republicans, like 163 Republicans voted for it, and like 25 or 26 voted against it. 22 Democrats voted for it, and I want to say 155 or 156 Democrats voted against it. So there is this party split, but it was a bipartisan effort to pass it. And then it went to the Senate, and the Senate refused to even hold a roll call vote. And that prompted one of the best in the House, Representative Emily Phillips, to challenge her own Senator Gannon. Yep, because he had committed to her personally that he would call for a roll call vote in the Senate, and then he refused to do it. He sat silent, and I watched the hearing, and I watched him sitting there, and my blood started boiling, and Emily decided to do something about it. She ran against him unsuccessfully, but that shows some real backbone on Emily's part. The New Hampshire Senate has a very, very long history of protecting the body by not holding roll call votes. But some people may not understand why are roll call votes so important. It helps voters and it helps activists to identify who are the bad guys. See, good legislation takes time, Eric. It takes sometimes decades to pass. And it takes effort, and it takes organization, it takes focusing resources, and it takes a turnover in the legislature to make it happen. Opposition to bills, to good legislation, has to be removed. And we have to have a roll call vote to know who needs to be given the pink slip by the voters. And, New Hampshire is building this awesome free state that is full of live and let live, liberty-loving representatives in the House, people like Tom Mannion. And then there's others, like Representative Tim McGuff, who are now running for the Senate, trying to take some of that liberty to the upper chamber. And Tom's actually running against a Senator Shannon Shadley, who is a protectionist and who fully participates in that non-roll call vote system. So we're making strides with good candidates in the Senate. Victoria Sullivan was a good candidate in the Senate. Also, she's up for election in November. And also with gubernatorial candidates like Chuck Morse, who ran a very spirited campaign in the primary. Unfortunately, fell a little bit short. But there's a lot more work to be done. And we have some awesome grassroots folks in New Hampshire. A National Guard veteran named Derek Prue, who is leading the charge. He's doing really good work, and he fully understands this issue. And he's building an activist army and following the Bring Our Troops Home model that we teach of recruitment, train, mobilize, and staying laser focused on one issue. He's an absolute powerhouse warrior, and he's working with our field director, Diego Rivera, and they have a robust phone banking effort in New Hampshire. You can learn more about that at defendtheguard.us/phone bank. And that phone bank has produced predicted and consistent results every time it's utilized. And so New Hampshire it's a fantastic fight. Talking about lifting where you stand and where you have the most leverage. The average New Hampshire legislator represents about 3,200 to 3,500 voters. And most of the rest of the country, a representative represents about 15 to 20,000 registered voters. And so we have a lot more leverage there, and the fight is robust and it's active. And Idaho and New Hampshire are going to race each other to get across the finish line this year.
Yeah, and it is worth giving a shout out to Emily Phillips for making the effort, for her work in the House, and for taking the risk to challenge her senator in her own party in a primary. Ultimately, she did not prevail in the primary election, but even just making the challenge costs your enemies resources and makes them run scared. And so even falling short, I think there is still victories to celebrate in the process, and also some lessons to learn for the future. And boy, Senator Gannon, what a villain name. It's like the evil villain from Zelda. We didn't get the Triforce of Power wrested away from him this time, but he should watch out because Link and Zelda are coming back for him in the future. Final thing, because we're running out of time. Obviously, I'll see you Saturday. Looking forward to that. But I did want to ask you, you are a citizen of the state of Idaho. And just a few weeks ago on the show, I had on the executive director of the Greater Idaho Movement, which is Eastern Oregon attempting to break away and join Idaho. 13 counties have done that. By the way, I suggested on social media that the 2nd District of Maine should do the same, break away and join New Hampshire. And that was just on the front page of the Lewiston Sun-Journal yesterday. So it's an idea that when people hear it, they react to it at very least. As a citizen of Idaho, what do you make of folks in neighboring states who are freedom-loving people, but are being not represented by the kind of government they want to represent them? What do you make of people wanting to come and join your state by moving your actual state border?
Yeah, I think people want to have a sense of community. They want to live amongst people that think and believe in the same value system. We don't have to agree on everything, but we want to agree on the same principles of freedom. And I'll take everybody that is in the high plains, high desert plains of Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington, all of Idaho, and even parts of Northern California who want to join this movement, because we want one thing: leave us alone. Let us live our lives free of government oppression. Let us keep our property. Let us keep our liberty. Let us worship. Let us pray how we want. Let us send our kids to the schools that they want to go to. Let us not send our children off to fight wars in faraway nations that we can't even find on a map. And so I would welcome anybody from those places. And I don't know what it is, but if you look at Washington, Oregon, where they're talking this proposed greater Idaho line, it's all high mountain desert, sagebrush, sparse trees, junipers. It's where you have to have this rugged kind of self-preservation industrial spirit to take care of yourself. It's not like the big cities that are on the coast that are in these lush forests with plenty of resources. It's where you have to be hardy. You have to have your hands in the dirt. You have to have this metal in your spine that doesn't come from living in the Kush culture on the coasts of both sides of the nation. So I'd welcome them. I don't know if it'll ever happen. It's fun to talk about, but that's not the focus of my organization. My organization is laser focused on a single issue. But I appreciate the question. I think it's fun to talk about.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about. Well, hey, we are running out of time. Last word, where can people follow you and learn more about Bring Our Troops Home and Defend the Guard?
Yep, there's two websites. Our organization is bringourtroopshome.us, and you can go there and you can enlist in the movement. You can sign up to become a member of our club. It's called the Remnant Organization. It's kind of our supporters club. And we all know the story of the Remnant, the gathering of the people who all believe in one thing but didn't have a leader to follow. Well, we feel like this issue is the call of the Remnant to bring them all together. And we can talk about that more another time. But if you want to know about the legislation specifically, defendtheguard.us. You can click on your state and find out who your bill sponsor is, and then you can sign a petition to support their efforts. These are very practical things that you can do, and we print out all of those petitions, and we do deliver them to the state houses, to their representatives, and let them know that you support Defend the Guard. And the final message I would say is it doesn't matter what your action is, as long as it's actual action that's tangible, that has a result, and is worthy of doing. And that's why we believe that communities around the country, state capitals is where we should fight, and that we believe that Boise, Idaho, not the Beltway in DC, will stop the war machine.
Awesome. Dan, I look forward to seeing you on Saturday, and thank you for joining us on the Porcupine Report.
Thank you, my friends. Good talking to you.
All right, everyone, that's the show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Of course, we are bringing you a new episode every single Wednesday at 7:00 p.m. on all your favorite podcasting apps and on all the social media platforms, at least the ones that allow videos that go up to an hour for the Free State Project. So if you have not yet done so, please like and share this episode and other episodes that you enjoy. Leave help supporting comments and reviews. All of these things help spread the reach of the program. So please go ahead and do that. If you love liberty, then you certainly know that your friends, your family, your neighbors who love liberty are going to enjoy the conversations, the free range conversations we are having here on this show about freedom. So that is appreciated very much. And as always, I want to remind you, if you are in the state of New Hampshire or you're thinking about making a visit, always check out the website, fsp.org. And in particular, check out our community calendar with all of the events that are taking place. There's pretty much an event almost happening every single day in the Free State for people who love freedom and want to be in community with others who do so as well. And tickets are on sale for our upcoming events for next year, the New Hampshire Liberty Forum and the Porcupine Freedom Festival. You can learn all about those on the website. And thank you, as always, to our technical producer, Renita, for operating behind the scenes to make this show look so wonderful. And that's all I got. Furthermore, my opinion is, everyone, the Federal Reserve should be destroyed. Talk to you all next week.